Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our Friday afternoon colloquium. Always feels a bit weird with the shades down when it's a nice day outside, but I think that's for the video purposes and for attention on the screen and to the speaker. It's a great pleasure to have one of our own faculty, Professor Betar Gallant, speaking today. She is an associate professor and the Kendall Rosenau Associate Professor in our Department of Mechanical Engineering. She's also the faculty director of the MIT GE Renova Energy Climate Alliance, which is an amazing new large-scale collaboration with a really exciting company. If you haven't heard about that, I encourage you to read about it and attend some events because there's exciting research and engagement and recruitment opportunities there. But the focus today is Professor Gallant's research, and the title of her talk is Mastering Complexity at Reacting Electrode Interfaces. Let's give her a welcome.
Thank you so much, and it's really nice to see a lot of electrochemistry friends in the audience, so thanks to all of you who came far and wide to join the talk today. So electrochemistry has a central role to play in decarbonization efforts because it allows us to directly drive, using renewable electricity, the chemical transformations that allow us to store energy, whether in batteries for transportation or for grid regulation, or in the synthesis of chemicals and fuels, as with CO2 electrolysis. However, these devices have yet to reach their full potential, and this is due in large part to parasitic reactions that occur at the electrode interfaces, posing challenges that really the whole field has been working very hard to overcome. So, taking batteries as an example, if you look at a lithium metal plating reaction, as you would have in a lithium metal battery, on paper it's relatively simple. So you transfer an electron to a lithium ion to form lithium metal at the interface. What could go wrong? But in practice, it's actually quite a lot more complex than that, involving the participation of partially desolvated lithium ions that react and decompose to form a derived passivation layer that strands lithium irreversibly in this layer and leads to cycling inefficiency. Okay, so I'll be talking a lot more about that in my talk today. And as a second example, I will be talking about how competition of reactants at electrode interfaces really sensitively affects the selectivity of products in CO2 conversion from capture solutions. So starting with batteries. So lithium-ion batteries have really made tremendous progress, really just in the course of my academic lifetime. So in the last 10 years or so, we've seen around a 40% increase in the energy density, okay? And so this has been enough to take electric vehicles from something that was kind of a dream during my PhD to a reality that in many ways we take for granted today. So a lithium-ion battery is comprised of a graphite anode and a transition metal oxide cathode, both of which act as host structures for the reversible storage of lithium ions. Now, during cell discharge, which is depicted by the arrows here, electrons move from the graphite anode, where they're in a higher energy state, to the cathode. And lithium ions deintercalate from here. They go through the electrolyte and then insert in the cathode. Okay, and then this is a reversible process, so you can drive it in the other direction to recharge. Now, the cell energy density is the product of the potential difference between the two electrodes, or the cell voltage, times the amount of charge we can store, or the gravimetric capacity. And both of these are sensitively determined by the selection of the electrode material. So the improvements that I mentioned before in energy density have largely been due to improvements in the cathode design, moving from lithium cobalt oxide in initial commercialized cells in the 1990s to today, higher capacity materials like nickel-rich NMC, with relatively limited innovation on the anode side. However, it has always been and still remains the so-called holy grail in the field to be able to move from graphite anodes to lithium metal. And this is for a simple reason. Lithium metal is the densest way to store lithium charge. And you see that reflected in the gravimetric capacity. It's 10 times higher than that of graphite, okay? Meanwhile, its redox potential is effectively the same as that of graphite, so we can retain high cell voltages. So this is the ideal. So why don't we see commercialized lithium metal batteries today? And the reason is that lithium is so reactive. In fact, it's so highly reactive that all of our electrolyte ingredients, both the organic solvents and the salt anions, are thermodynamically unstable in contact with it. So what happens when you plate lithium is it will react with the electrolyte and form a layer that is comprised of decomposed electrolyte byproducts. And this accumulates on the surface and is known as the solid electrolyte interphase, or the SEI. So the SEI, at least a good one, one that functions, is electronically insulating. So this process continues until you can no longer tunnel electrons from the metallic lithium through the electrolyte, so it's self-terminating. And that determines the thickness, and typical thickness would be on the order of a couple to tens of nanometers, depending on the electrolyte chemistry. Very fortuitously, the SEI is lithium ion conductive. So you can transport lithium through it, you can plate it underneath, and then you can reverse that process in a stripping process. Other functional requirements of the SEI, we want it to support uniform lithium flux as much as possible, and it needs to be mechanically robust to accommodate the volume changes that occur during lithium metal plating and stripping. And I want to emphasize that graphite also faces similar challenges in a way. It forms an SEI, and that was actually essential to the commercialization success. However, the SEI, I would say, has less demands placed upon it because graphite undergoes far less extreme volume changes during its cycling. Okay, so getting the lithium SEI just right is really challenging, and it really remains a grand challenge in the field. So because the SEI is derived from the electrolyte, every time we change the electrolyte formulation, we have a different SEI that we have to understand. Moreover, there are different models that we use to describe the microstructure, and that will also depend on the electrolyte formulation, from the mosaic model to other types of layered and amorphous suspended crystallites like shown here. Okay. And I really want to underline the fact that these are models. So we use them to kind of organize our thinking and understanding about the SEI and explain its basic physics to us, but there's still so much we don't understand, okay? So this picture here is really imprecise. Nevertheless, there's some underlying physics common to all of these systems that is really kind of central to our understanding of the SEI. And that's the following. So we know that closest to the lithium SEI interface, where we have the most reducing environment right next to lithium, you tend to find the most ionic, highly reduced phases, and that tends to be lithium fluoride and lithium oxide because most of our electrolytes rely on fluorine or oxygen, okay? Out here, closer to the electrolyte side, we tend to see less reduced, more organic phases derived from the solvent. So the key performance metric for measuring or determining the reversibility of lithium plating and stripping is the Coulombic efficiency. And we measure it as is shown here. So we have a copper current collector, that's our working electrode. And there's an opposing lithium reservoir that's not shown here. And we apply a reducing potential. We plate a certain amount of capacity onto the current collector, Q1. Some of that will plate as metallic lithium. A degree of that will react to form the SEI. And then we reverse that process, do an oxidation reaction, and strip as much of the reversible lithium back, and that gives us some charge Q2. And so the Coulombic efficiency is determined, at least in the simplest case, as the ratio of Q2 to Q1. There are other ways that we measure it, but this is the most straightforward. So this is what the residuals on the copper current collector actually look like following a stripping process in a practical sample. And so in the ideal case, when we're stripping lithium, we're able to remove all of the metallic lithium, and all we're left with on the current collector is the SEI. So in this case, the Coulombic inefficiency is directly determined by how much of the SEI we had to form. Now, realistically, there's another capacity loss mode. What can happen is that the metallic lithium can become pinched off due to necking effects, and it can become stranded as metallic lithium within the SEI, so you don't recover it either. So in the most general case, the capacity loss is partitioned into two modes: ionic SEI lithium and metallic lithium. And the demands on reversibility are extraordinarily high. So for an electric vehicle battery, we need to cycle 1,000 times, and typically we want to retain 80% of the energy density over that lifetime. So even neglecting any voltage fade, and just considering capacity fade alone, you would think that something like 99.9% sounds really high for a single plating and stripping step. But if you do that 1,000 times, you're left with only 37% of your active lithium inventory by the end, okay? So you really need to be at 99.98%. So where is the field today? We're starting to see more and more electrolytes that can get around 99.6, 99.7, occasionally 99.9, but usually the 99.9 is not over 1,000 cycles, and we see degradation. So in some ways, we've never been this close, and in some ways, we're still really, really far. And so we really have to get this exactingly right. So our margin of error here is this 0.02%. So if we have to get the SEI exactly right, what are the design principles for designing a good SEI? It turns out that this is a question that has motivated the field for actually decades, and we still lack a really clear answer to this, and that's simply because the SEI is so challenging to characterize. It has nanoscale thickness, it's extremely reactive with air, it's unstable, very fragile, And our spectroscopy methods today, like IR, XPS, can be informative, but they're not sufficiently quantitative, and they're often only looking at a portion of the sample. They're not telling us about the entirety of the sample, which is what we need to understand to get back to thinking about capacity loss at an electrode level. So it turns out that we can actually exploit the fact that there's material accumulating on the current collector during cycling. For instance, as I mentioned, the material contains metallic lithium. So one thing we can do is react it with water, and the lithium will evolve hydrogen stoichiometrically. We can count up how many moles of hydrogen are evolved, and then convert that to the equivalent capacity that was on the sample that corresponds to that capacity loss mode. Okay, so we can figure out how much is there. This is work done not by us, but by Shirley Meng a few years ago. We found that if you change the titrant to acid, you can start to get more information because there are many SEI phases that will be protonated by acid and evolve signature gases that you can then quantify. So we can start to get information on actually quite a diverse set of species in the sample. And once we've extracted the gases for headspace analysis, another nice thing about these acid titrations is it actually digests and dissolves the entirety of the sample, and there's more information we can glean by looking at the liquid that's left behind. So for example, we can quantify the total amount of lithium that was present in the sample. We can look at the amount of lithium fluoride that was in the SEI by NMR, and we can look at other anion-derived phases. So the point I want to make is simply that we can really expand our capacity loss attributions by switching the titrant. So we looked at, as an initial demonstration now a couple of years ago, quantifying the capacity loss breakdown in this conventional carbonate electrolyte, 1 molar lithium PF6 and EC-DEC, and we were able to assign about 70% of the capacity loss at that time. So you'll notice in this particular case, most of the capacity loss went to forming lithium zero or dead lithium, and we could resolve of the SEI losses about a third of them, with the majority of them going to these CO2 evolving phases such as lithium carbonate or semicarbonate. But obviously there was quite a shortfall here, and this is really corresponding to the phases that were not reactive with acid, so we didn't have a way to detect what was there. And, you know, there are a lot of other possible SEI phases, but in a sense, the possibilities are bounded. We know really what should be in this gray zone here. So there's ionic lithium zero, and then there's the organic phases derived from the solvent, okay, that are not acid reactive. So coming back to this picture, you know, we could see lithium fluoride, but really being unable to see lithium oxide was really challenging because, as I mentioned, it's really the other kind of key ionic phase in the SEI. So we set about trying to address this and develop a titration that was selective towards lithium oxide in these samples. So with some trial and error, we landed on the following reaction. You can react lithium oxide with butoxyethanol. It will convert the lithium oxide to lithium hydroxide, and then you can quantify how much lithium hydroxide is in your sample using Carl Fisher titration, which we do in our lab. We also expanded the titration toolkit, so there were a few additional ones we added in this particular study, including one for lithium nitride. I'll spend a little less time focusing on that. So coming back to the electrolyte that I just showed you, you can see that we did, in fact, detect lithium oxide there, and it wound up being actually the most prevalent SEI phase in this particular electrolyte. So we're really starting to chip away at the unknown. So we can confirm lithium oxide is there. And now armed with this set of capabilities, what we were really interested in doing is looking broadly across the electrolyte space and looking for which SEI phases correlate most strongly with Coulombic efficiency, okay? So this graph here shows the record Coulombic efficiencies achieved in the field over time. There are a tremendous number of acronyms here, and I don't expect you to process all of them. So I'll summarize. The key thread in all of these is an overwhelming reliance on electrolyte fluorination. So I mentioned this at the outset, but I want to underscore it here. All of our high-performance electrolytes tend to rely overwhelmingly on the FSI anion, which has fluorinated, and also combinations of fluorinated additives, solvents, and diluents, okay, such as the example shown here. And so it's actually not too surprising when we go to characterize these SEI that we, using other methods, tend to find lithium fluoride as pretty prevalent, especially in these high-performance electrolytes. So this has led to a kind of rule of thumb or a belief in the field that lithium fluoride is the most universally desirable functional lithium SEI phase. But that hadn't really been scrutinized in a quantitative way, and now we had the tools to do that. So we chose a set of 10 diverse electrolytes spanning different electrolyte classes, looking at carbonates, ethers, some other high-performance systems, and looking at a range of Coulombic efficiencies. And we applied our capacity loss methods to them. Okay. So what you see here in the middle is an example of 3 of these, and you see the capacity loss broken down by rank. So you start to see the diversity emerging here. And then over here, we rank them all in order of lowest to highest Coulombic efficiency. So we get this kind of informative fingerprint, if you will, of where the capacity is being stranded in these cells. So one thing I want to start by emphasizing is that in some of these cases, we could resolve for the first time 100% or close to it of the capacity loss in the sample. So that's really a marked improvement from where we started out. The second thing you can do is start to pull out some trends by eye. So for example, going from lower to higher Coulombic efficiency, you see less of this blue here, which is dead lithium. So decreasing dead lithium leads to higher Coulombic efficiency. This is already known in the field, and our results also validate it. But you also see increased prevalence of this orange here, which is lithium oxide. So to make better sense of the trends with Coulombic efficiency, we conducted a statistical analysis, and it tells us essentially of all of the different phases which have the strongest correlation with CE. So of the SEI phases, the two that correlate most strongly are shown here. Lithium fluoride does have a positive correlation. However, the correlation with lithium oxide is actually quite substantially stronger than that with lithium fluoride. And this was, I think, surprising to many in the field. And the correlation is actually even stronger than that of the anti-correlation between dead lithium and Coulombic efficiency. We expanded the data set further. We looked at 8 additional electrolytes for a total of 18. You see here the relationship between Coulombic efficiency and lithium oxide content in the SEI, and the statistical significance actually increased further. So if it's true that lithium oxide is the SEI phase that most strongly correlates with Coulombic efficiency, we should be able to exploit this to design new electrolytes that are oxygenated and impart lithium oxide to the SEI and demonstrate that we can reach comparable performance as the fluorinated analogs. And this would be quite compelling if we're able to do that, because fluorination is expensive, requires quite toxic synthesis. And I would argue that we've already kind of extensively explored the landscape, not exhaustively, but it would be nice to open up new directions in electrolyte design. So we did that, and we set about developing electrolytes that rely on fully oxygenated anions instead of oxygenated fluorinated or fully fluorinated. Some oxygen-rich additives such as nitrate shown here, and then all based on a kind of oxygenate solvent, DME, shown here. And so we designed both low fluorine and fluorine-free formulations using these. And in particular, with this case here, where we have a completely fluorine-free electrolyte, we were able to breach 99% Coulombic efficiency for the first time. Okay, no fluorine. So of course, 99% is not 99.95 or 98%. Okay, so this is really exciting. It shows that maybe there's a pathway we have overlooked, and we should invest more time into getting these numbers to be higher. But I think this was very surprising to many in the community that we could even get numbers that start to get into this range. Okay. And just to make the point, we took a high-performance electrolyte that used the FSI anion, which has fluorine, and we replaced it with either lithium BF4 or PF6 anions, so fully fluorinated anions, changing nothing else, and the capacity actually decreased quite a lot. So in other words, fluorination is really not a unique path to high Coulombic efficiency, and in fact, you don't always necessarily see fluorination translate to high performance. So beyond the analysis we've done so far, we can also start to look at cross-correlations among loss modes. And so here I will show you this through the lens of an example that is based on some data that had been puzzling and interesting to the field for a number of years, which is that if you take some kind of classical carbonate electrolytes and you add CO2 gas as an additive, it can actually dramatically improve the lithium cyclability. So we were interested in understanding, first of all, does that apply to an expanded set of electrolytes? And also, why would that be the case? Why would adding CO2 improve cyclability? So we looked at a set of 5 electrolytes here, ranging from more diverse carbonates to an ether base to a high-performance electrolyte. And what you see here is the Coulombic efficiency first with no CO2, so just assembled under argon. Most of these are below 90%, but the LHCe electrolyte is higher. And then the Coulombic efficiency when we add CO2 into the system. And so in 4 out of 5 of these cases, we saw a significant improvement in Coulombic efficiency, all above 90, with the exception being the last case where we didn't see a change. Basically, the performance started high and ended high. So this tells us that CO2 has more universally possible benefits for lithium cycling than was previously known. That's fine, but now we actually have the tools to be able to tell us why. So using titrations, we dug into that question. This graph shows now the change in capacity loss, okay, moving from the cells with argon to those with CO2. So anything below the x-axis here that's negative means that the capacity loss decreased when you have CO2 present. In other words, the Coulombic efficiency increased. So the solid bar, for example, in this electrolyte here is the total capacity loss change. And then to the left, we can see whether that's attributable to SEI in blue or inactive lithium zero change in gray. And so in the 4 cases where we saw an improvement, we saw that the improvement was largely, in fact, overwhelmingly, due to a decrease in dead lithium in the sample. The exception is this one here, where there really wasn't much dead lithium to start with, so we didn't see much change. And so this graph really kind of brings it all together. This graphs the capacity loss partitioning to dead lithium as a function of Coulombic efficiency. And you see this kind of universal trend line where increasing Coulombic efficiency requires decreasing the dead lithium in the sample. And so what happens when we add CO2, we're basically moving just down and to the right. Okay, but the physics that are governing the system are really the same physics. And so this was very fascinating to see. So overall, what we learned is that by imparting CO2 into the cells, we can affect the SEI composition. So there are more CO2-derived phases. I haven't shown you those data, but we've looked at that. And then that, in fact, couples to a decrease in this other lost mode, which is dead lithium. So to our knowledge, that was actually the first time we've seen SEI phases directly impacting the formation of lithium zero. And that was very exciting for us. So beyond quantifying the composition, we've also been interested in developing quantitative descriptors that capture the function of the SEI. And so a parameter that we were quite interested in is the exchange current, or J naught. So the exchange current fundamentally describes the facility with which an ion can be exchanged from the bulk electrolyte to the underlying electrode. So it's a measure of the kinetics. And typically, we invoke this term in systems like electrocatalytic systems where you don't necessarily have a changing interface. Okay, so they're relatively simpler, or at least unchanging, relatively simpler electron transfer reactions here. Okay, and we have certain established methods to be able to measure it. We were interested in seeing if we could learn about how the SEI modulates this exchange reaction, because that's fundamentally what it needs to do. It needs to be able to accept a desolvated lithium ion, then the lithium ion has to transport through it, and then you have an electron transfer and a plating reaction underneath it. So we posited that this parameter, if we could figure out how to measure it on a reacted lithium surface, would actually tell us something sensitively about the SEI, and perhaps even tell us how exchange relates to Coulombic efficiency and reversibility. So we set about developing 2 methods to quantify the exchange current on lithium. I won't go into all of the details, but in both cases, we were cycling the cell to express the fresh lithium surface, then we allow that lithium surface to react, and then we probe the exchange of the SEI that forms. So in the first case, we do galvanostatic cycling with intermittent impedance spectroscopy. We can use an equivalent circuit model to fit the spectra, and then we pull out a measure of J naught. And in the second case, we do cyclic voltammetry with TAFL analysis. Okay. And so this graph now pulls together data across 9 different electrolytes, each represented by a different color, shown here. And the key point is that using the 2 different methods, we could get a nice equivalence, nice agreement between the 2, provided that we controlled for the same amount of cycled lithium in both cases. Okay, so that starts to tell us that we were measuring something that was physically real. And now we can look at how the exchange current density relates to Coulombic efficiency. And as shown here, you see a pretty clear positive correlation between the 2. So in other words, if SEI that support high reversibility are also SEI that facilitate high lithium exchange rates. Now, there was an interesting observation in our data. So I mentioned that we were cycling and probing the J naught over a cycle number. And so we actually found in some cases, like these first 5 electrolytes shown here, that the J naught value that we measured was pretty independent of cycle number. So this graph depicts that. This shows the ratio of the value measured on the 50th cycle to that measured on the 10th cycle. And for this first set of systems, there's pretty much one descriptive value that we can use to describe exchange through that SEI. But there are a couple of other examples or counterexamples, and particularly for the high Coulombic efficiency systems, we saw that the J naught value continued to increase with cycling. So it was more like a dynamic parameter. Eventually, they do stabilize, okay, if you cycle beyond what we've shown here. And so we really wanted to understand why and what that was telling us, but clearly we can't just assign a single representative value to these cases. It's going to be dependent on the conditions. So we were really interested in understanding why high Coulombic efficiency electrolytes have increasing J naught. This turned out to be very hard to measure, but we kind of pulled it together with the following model that we proposed. So for low Coulombic efficiency systems, you plate lithium, you form an SEI as depicted in the red outline shown here. And then when you strip it, you're left with some inactive material on the surface. Now, if this is low Coulombic efficiency and it has low exchange, then there's no preference necessarily to reuse this material to plate lithium. And so you actually cannot use it. And so you have to kind of renucleate and grow a new lithium deposit alongside. And so you wind up with relatively low Coulombic efficiency because you have to reform the entire surface. And that corresponds to the low J naught values. In contrast, when you have a high Coulombic efficiency SEI, we propose that you plate it, and then you can strip it. But because this material now has a very facile ability to exchange lithium, you can actually plate lithium underneath it. And so what that would lead to is the ability to kind of reuse a kind of scaffold. And then you would have relatively lower new surface formation, hence high Coulombic efficiency. And that would correspond with high J naught. So we had just proposed this at the time. We didn't have direct evidence, but I'm pleased to say that we're recently actually seeing evidence that this is really the case. So this shows on top, this is a particular electrolyte that has a low Coulombic efficiency and low J naught value. And you can actually, after stripping, see all the dead material that's kind of accumulated on the surface. And you can also visualize the stranded lithium zero that's present in the sample that we weren't able to strip out. And then for a high Coulombic efficiency, high J naught sample, we actually start to be able to visualize the scaffolding. So it might be hard to see, but this looks almost like a deflated set of balloons, right? And so you can imagine being able to plate underneath this kind of thin skin and therefore not need to reform so much new SEI on the next cycle. So this is really exciting. I think we're starting to see our work kind of come full circle, thinking about dead lithium, capacity loss partitioning, and J naught and Coulombic efficiency. So we're trying to kind of unify this understanding. Another thing that J naught can tell us practically, we learned that it effectively governs how the rates at which we're able to plate and strip lithium. So for electrolytes that have low J naught values, such as these two examples shown in gray, if we try to plate and strip lithium at a rate that exceeds that inherently of their exchange current, we see that the Coulombic efficiency decreases quite a lot, so they become unstable and they can't keep up with the rates that are demanded. On the other hand, if we look at the high J naught systems, we see that we're able to go to much higher plating and stripping current densities and still have high reversibility. Okay, so functionally, J naught really helps govern the rate capability of these electrodes as well. So what we're working to understand moving forward is now really understand microscopically what are the SEI phases, which we have the tools to measure, that underlie this high J naught. And I think once we can do that, we'll have a unified picture. Okay, so once we fully understand which SEI we are trying to build, how do we actually do that? So it's long been known in the battery field that the species that are coordinated to the lithium cation are those that are promoted to be most likely to participate in SEI formation. And this is actually really relevant increasingly as we have more complex electrolyte designs. Sometimes there are multiple solvents, sometimes we have additives, there can even be dual salt anions. So we really want to understand how to construct the coordination environment that we want in order to get the SEI that we want. But this winds up being challenging because as experimentalists, we often don't have direct access or control over what the coordination sphere looks like. Instead, what we're able to do is kind of mix ingredients A, B, and C, and then we tend to, perhaps we're aiming for a certain coordination environment. We take it to the lab, we characterize it, then we measure the performance. It may not be what we want, and then we kind of iterate laboriously through this process, which can take quite a lot of time to get the performance where we want it. And even then, maybe not precisely controlling this picture here. So all of this would be more efficient if we had direct access experimentally to the thermodynamic parameters that govern the coordination partitioning from the bulk to the lithium environment, okay? We unfortunately at the moment tend to have access to these parameters only computationally, which is valuable, but we really want to be able to do that experimentally. It turns out the biological field has solved this problem and has some very nice methods to do this. So what's shown here is isothermal titration calorimetry, or ITC. Typically how it works, in those applications, you have a sample vial containing a macromolecule dissolved in a solvent or a solution, a reference vial that's the same composition and remains unchanged throughout the course of the experiment, and then you titrate into the sample vial a ligand. And the ligand will undergo a binding reaction with the macromolecule and absorb or release heat. And we measure that as the power that the calorimeter requires to retain the sample vial under isothermal conditions with respect to the reference vial. Okay, so from this, we can directly determine the enthalpy of the interaction. And so in a high affinity reaction, like you have with many biological interactions, you'll get this type of a profile here that maps the delta H per injection over the extent of the titration. And for a high affinity reaction, you have a sigmoidal curve like this. And that allows us to actually determine or decouple the delta G of the interactions, delta H, and also N, which is the stoichiometry of the interaction between ligand and macromolecule. If we have a low affinity reaction, we'll get a response that looks something like this. Still informative, but we need to do more work to be able to decouple the parameter. So we proposed an analogy to an electrolyte. In our analogy, the lithium cation is acting like the macromolecule, and it's initially dissolved in a weak solvent, or S1, and we inject a strong solvent, S2. So if a preferential coordination event occurs, there will be a displacement reaction with some heat signal, and then we can track that and hopefully pull out the thermodynamics of that exchange reaction. Okay, so that will tell us exactly what drives preferential coordination between two species in competition. So this graph now shows the ITC result for such an experiment using propylene carbonate or acetonitrile as the weak solvent, DMSO as the strong solvent, and 0.1 molar lithium TFSI as the salt. And so the response, delta H per injection, is shown here in orange. And you can see right away that we do see a displacement reaction occurring as DMSO displaces these coordinating species in the environment of lithium. However, it is a low affinity reaction, so we don't see the nice sigmoidal response that we would need to be able to directly pull out the thermodynamic. So we need an independent measure that can help us bring more information into the analysis. And so we can exploit the fact that by the Gibbs-Faraday relation shown here, that the Gibbs free energy change in an electrochemical cell is directly proportional to the open circuit voltage of the cell. So we can do in an electrochemical cell the same titration experiment and monitor as we titrate the strongly coordinating solvent in how the open circuit voltage responds, and that's reflecting the stabilization of lithium as it's increasingly coordinated by DMSO. So we get nice data sets as shown here. And now, armed with these two data sets, we need to unify them. And the way that we do that is we develop an underlying model that can describe the binding interactions thermodynamically with a sound physical basis across both data sets. So I'm not going to get into all of the details because it would take quite a bit of time, but I'll just summarize the key points. So we model these interactions as sequential displacement reactions, okay, starting from solvent 1, going through sequential displacements up to a full coordination sphere of solvent 2. We can describe the reaction like this. We have corresponding stability constants shown here. And ultimately, this allows us to get to a binding polynomial that is effectively, conceptually, and mathematically equivalent to our partition function. The assumptions that we have to make are that the cation has a constant number of interaction sites and that the sites are independent and identical. Okay. So with some math that's under the hood, we run this model and we're actually able to fit both of our data sets, both the titration data and the OCV data. And the fits are actually quite good, as shown in the solid lines, for 3 different strong solvents, DMSO, DMA, and DMF. Okay. So we're really able to describe these data quite well, and so that lets us unpackage and access the thermodynamic parameters. So I'll just end by this part of the talk by giving you a sense of what this allows us to learn. So for example, we can map out for a particular fraction of a strong solvent in the bulk electrolyte, how much of that is going to go into the coordination sphere. Okay, hence be promoted to participate in SEI forming reactions. Right, so this is really powerful. For example, just a small amount of these solvents will actually lead to their disproportionate enrichment in the coordination environment. We can also map out the progressive driving forces as we sequentially displace 1, 2, 3, 4 of the weaker solvent with a stronger solvent. And we can also map out the distribution of the complexes as a function of the strong solvent in the bulk. Okay, so we can really get experimentally based microscopic insights. So there's a few notes. The first is we developed this approach using some exemplar strong and weak solvents, but we believe that this can be expanded to an arbitrary system, a dual solvent or additive system, provided that it obeys the assumptions that went into our binding model. So we think that this is a really enabling approach that can be used for future electrolyte design. We initially restricted our salt concentrations to be relatively low, 0.1 molar, and that's because we wanted to exclude any possible changes in cation-anion pairing throughout the titrations because our models didn't account for that. We validated that with spectroscopy, but we're actually now working on expanding our model so that we can account for ion pairing interaction changes as would be relevant to more commercially relevant salt concentrations. But overall, I hope you see, we now start to have an answer to this question. And what we're really excited about now is being able to kind of predictively pinpoint specific favored coordination environments and then test hypotheses about how that affects the SEI and Coulombic efficiency. So just an outlook on our battery work. This is really the vision. We are trying to get towards this picture of precision SEI design. We want to know what the SEI really needs to look like at a very atomically precise level. And now we're figuring out how to design the bulk electrolytes to actually build the coordination environments that allow us to build that without loss. And I just want to mention that although we focus on lithium today, we're also applying this to other beyond lithium systems, such as sodium as part of the DOE battery hub. We're studying the SEI very carefully. And this also has great relevance to graphite. We're doing some work to understand the formation cycle and aging of graphite, which is actually still not very well understood in the field, despite its commercial success. Okay, now I'm going to switch gears completely and talk about a second example, which is CO2 conversion from capture solutions. And by the end of this, I hope you see that this is a system where interesting interfacial competition is really kind of the key variable that we want to be able to control. So in conventional CO2 capture, we use a sorbent, typically an amine such as monoethanol amine shown here. And we bubble the flue gas through the sorbent, typically at temperatures around 40 degrees C. Then a reaction happens. The two amine molecules in this case react to bind one CO2, and we form a carbamate species and an ammonium species stoichiometrically alongside. And then once this solution is saturated, we run it through a desorber at higher temperature. So we apply heat to reverse the reaction, bubble off CO2, and then the output of this process is a concentrated CO2 stream that you can presumably store or do something with. So there are some challenges with this process that help understand why we don't see it, widespread on our power plants. This is a very energy-intensive desorption process. We require steam as a slipstream from the power plant turbine. So it winds up leading to significant derating of the power plant's output. And then there are also high capital and operational expenses, one of which is related to the fact that continuously exposing the sorbent to high temperature leads to degradation. Okay, and that can be very costly and hard to maintain. So this is an energy-intensive process, and it doesn't necessarily solve what do we do with CO2. So downstream of this is a second technology, CO2 electrolyzers, that aims to upgrade or convert CO2 as a waste product into value-added chemicals and fuels. Okay, try to get more circularity and put a cap on the overall CO2 emissions. So these work by taking CO2 as an input, doing an electrochemical reduction reaction to various products using water or protons as a co-reactant. And then the opposing electrode does a water splitting reaction and releases oxygen. And nowadays we can run these electrolyzers pretty selectively for a certain class of reactions. So forming carbon monoxide as the product, we can do that generally pretty efficiently. Making more reduced and perhaps more value-added products like ethylene and ethanol, we can do that, but with lower selectivity. And one thing I want to emphasize here is that wherever you have an efficiency, Faradaic efficiency less than 100, the balance is made up usually, at least in a major sense, of parasitic hydrogen evolution. So this is just a parasitic process due to water reduction that's kind of running in the background and can often actually dominate your reaction. And we very often have to go to highly reducing potentials in order to compete with this parasitic reaction and actually get products in excess of the hydrogen. And CO2 electrolyzers have relatively high cell voltages, and they're also energy-intensive processes. And so the point here is that the energetics of this and then the energy requirements of the upstream separation accrue. And so there's been great interest in looking at whether we can actually avoid this intermediate regeneration step entirely. And the benefits are kind of summarized in this energy schematic shown here. So rather than having to regenerate and then concentrate and then go through this reaction to form product, perhaps using an electrolyzer, we can just directly capture the CO2, run an electrochemical reaction, and go straight to products without having to make the gas phase CO2 in between. So benefits include, process intensification. There's fewer steps, fewer losses potentially. There have been arguments that there can be cost advantages to doing it this way too. But I think a major advantage is this allows us to do everything electrically. Okay, so we can get away from a thermochemical process and drive everything ideally using renewable electricity. However, there are quite a lot of challenges. So now we're looking at doing an already complex reaction, CO2 reduction, on a capture solution. So when CO2 dissolves in water, even in the absence of amine sorbents, there's an equilibrium between CO2, carbonic acid, the bicarbonate, and the carbonate anion, depending on the pH of the solution. When we have the amine present, it becomes far more complicated. Okay, so now the amine can react with CO2. You can form carbamate, as I indicated to you on my introductory slide. The carbamate can actually react with water, and you can form bicarbonate eventually, and then there's the ammonium. Okay, so there are simply more species, and it gets a whole lot more complex. One thing I want to emphasize is that the pH for us is actually a design variable in these reactions, because when we first assemble the cell, there's no CO2 in there. We're typically at high pH. And as we bubble the CO2 into the cell, the pH drops. And where we kind of wind up and stabilize is going to depend on the partial pressure of the CO2 in the stream that we're trying to capture CO2 from. But generally speaking, we're working somewhere in this range. And all I really want you to take away from this is that we have quite a mix of reactants here. So figuring out, what is the active species for a given reaction is non-trivial. Nevertheless, we have tried. So, this really kind of frames the complexity. And now we're trying to convert CO2, captured CO2, to a product in a system that has 3 possible CO2 participants. So there's carbamate, that's the CO2 bound to the amine. There's bicarbonate, and there's physically dissolved CO2. And we also have 3 possible hydrogen evolution reaction participants. There's the ammonium cation, there's water, and there's bicarbonate. Okay. So we need to find a way to systematically figure out which species are responsible for certain reaction pathways, and then we can design to select the ones we want. So the first effort really looked at trying to understand what is the active CO2-bearing species to the electrode surface, and then I'll touch on some of our recent understanding looking at the hydrogen-evolving species. So in this and our following reactions, we're using silver as an electrocatalyst, so that tends to produce primarily carbon monoxide as a product, and we do that because it provides us a better model system. It's simpler for studying these reaction pathways. The catholyte is 2 molar of an amine, 2 molar of a supporting salt, KCl, and the anolyte is 1 molar KOH. We have a Nafion membrane in between. And typically we're applying a constant reducing potential, so we're doing chronoamperometry. And as I mentioned, we're using pH as a variable here, so we bubble to different CO2 partial pressures and then look at the outcome. So this graphs the product selectivity now upon reduction as a function of pH. And so you'll see at higher pH, as we go to lower pH, you start to see the selectivity to carbon monoxide increase, with the balance being hydrogen up here. So with this information now, we were interested in mapping this to the solution speciation to try to pull out which species appear to be correlating with the CO selectivity. And so that's shown here. In the middle graph, we have the carbamate concentration as a function of pH, and on the right-hand graph, we have bicarbonate. And so what's interesting here is that if you look at the range over which the CO selectivity is increasing, the carbamate has actually reached its maximum and is already decreasing by then. Okay, so we don't see a correlation between the carbamate concentration and CO. We do, however, see that over this region, that's where the bicarbonate hydrolysis reaction is occurring increasingly. And so we do see a pretty clear uptick in this that seems to correlate with CO selectivity. We looked at many more amine systems of diverse structures and different pKa values, and we generally found the same. So this appears to be universal. So increasing CO selectivity correlates with decreasing pH, which correlates with increasing bicarbonate concentration, but not bicarbonate, but not carbamate. Okay? So this suggests to us that the efficiency is really tracking with the bicarbonate concentration. And you might think that that's, kind of tied up and all said and done. But it's not quite so simple. If you look at a graph of the reaction rate forming CO as a function of the bicarbonate concentration, you'll see we do see a pretty good correlation for our different amine systems. But this cannot fully explain this trend because we also get very high CO production rates in a system that doesn't have amines in it, but the bicarbonate concentration is several orders of magnitude lower. So what we wound up finding is that really the tightest correlation across all systems universally is between the CO2 partial pressure, which is like a proxy for the dissolved CO2 in the system, and the CO selectivity. So what we concluded is that it's really actually the dissolved CO2 in the system that is receiving the electron and kind of active for CO2 conversion. But this CO2 actually has interesting pathways to regenerate it as it's consumed at the electrode surface, for example, through dehydration of bicarbonate. So that helps us gain a picture into kind of how we might further design these systems. We really want to maximize the dehydration or the regeneration of CO2 locally at the electrode surface. But another thing that we observed in these systems is that the systems with amines present tended to have elevated hydrogen evolution rates. And I mentioned before, we have multiple potential hydrogen evolution reaction participants. We have water, bicarbonate, and ammonium. And disentangling all of these different contributors is challenging in a system where they're all kind of mixed together. So we set about developing model systems that would isolate only pieces of this more complicated speciation map. So as you see here, these model solutions attempt to mimic the trade-off between lean amine and the protonated amine as a function of pH, but they don't contain any CO2. So we don't have to worry about the bicarbonate. And so then we measure the activity, and the results are shown over here. When we have relatively low total amount of amine present, we don't see much hydrogen evolution activity, or at least it's comparable to the water background, which is not shown explicitly here. But as we increase the concentration of the total amine in solution for a fixed pH value, we see markedly enhanced hydrogen evolution activity. So certainly these ammonia species are participating. But what was kind of puzzling to us at first is that concentration doesn't explain the whole picture, because as we're at the peak here and going from right to left to lower pH, we're actually increasing the concentration of this protonated species. So there's kind of two factors in competition here. And what we wound up learning from this is that the activity of the ammonium is actually very sensitively governed by its buffer capacity, which is mapped, as a kind of theoretical equation over to our activities here. So it doesn't account for everything, but it really does help to explain why we see a peak at a particular value associated with the pKa of that ammonium. But also fortuitously, we see that as we move away from that region, though if we operate our reduction reaction somewhere over here, we can actually avoid the high hydrogen evolution activities if we design our systems well enough. And I just want to say that this finding was actually universal across quite a number of different amines. So we also developed model bicarbonate solutions as shown here. So this has just bicarbonate concentrations as a function of pH mimicking the full capture solutions, but no amine. And you can see that we actually saw pretty good CO selectivities in this case. So this tells us that for the amount of bicarbonate that's present in the more complicated system, it's possible to get high selectivity. However, in the full capture systems, we're not realizing that just yet. We see lower selectivity, and that's because the ammonium are still getting to the surface and participating. I think the bright spot here is that if we look at the overall activity in the ammonium-only systems, it's actually quite high. But in the capture solutions that contain this kind of multitude of different species, it's already mitigated quite a lot. So that tells us that there are species that are outcompeting the approach of ammonium to get to the interface. Ammonium is still reaching the interface because we're still seeing higher hydrogen than we really want, but it's much mitigated compared to the ammonium-only conditions. So this points a path out for us where if we can figure out how to sequester the ammonium in the bulk solution or block or competitively outcompete its absorption at the electrode interface, we think that that's the path to get to higher selectivity. Okay, so I think I'll wrap up here. In summary, I just want to again, emphasize that we've been focusing a lot on mechanistic understanding, what's really under the hood at a molecular level for these kinds of reactions. But that's really given us the insight that we need to powerfully design improved systems. And so that's where we're going in our current and future work. And I want to thank my group, of course, many of whom are here. We have a multitude of wonderful projects, and I didn't have time to acknowledge or talk about all of them today, but I certainly could. And I really value working with you all. And thank you all for your attention. Thanks.
Hope we have some questions. Please raise your hand and I will run the microphone to you.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. So I had a question regarding when you mentioned that using carbon dioxide is like a very good thing. Is the role of oxygen in that also important? Because you had mentioned before the carbon dioxide portion that oxygen also helps. So is there something like where things with oxygen will could generally be useful?
Are you talking about the SEI or the...
Yeah, the SEI, for the SEI, not the
Well, we didn't look at them side by side in the same study. So sometimes electrolytes that tend to form CO2-derived phases in the SEI tend to be carbonate electrolytes, and they don't tend to have the highest performance. So kind of definitionally, at least at the moment, they don't necessarily give us the highest Coulombic efficiency. And the highest Coulombic efficiency systems tend to have a lot of lithium oxide. So immediately, we haven't unified that picture yet. But this was a source of CO2 that was non-solvent derived. So we were just bubbling CO2 gas through the electrolyte. That's a different way of, getting certain phases into the cell. Perhaps you favor lithium carbonate instead of semicarbonates, which is what you would form from solvent derived phases. So there could be something there, but we haven't got the answer to that yet.
Thank you for the talk. And I don't know enough about the chemistry, but looking at the literature, there's a lot of activity in solid electrolytes, LLZO, and even some polymer-based electrolytes. Are the same issues prevalent with solid electrolytes as opposed to the liquid that you concentrate on?
In a way, so interfacial reactions are a major issue, actually, with solid electrolytes, just as with liquids, but it's a different, I will say, type of problem and different chemistry. So inherently, you have a solid-solid reaction in those cases, so the phases you form are different. Compositional, let's say, landscape of solid electrolytes is different, so the phases that you'll form at that interface are going to be different from the case where we have solvent, for example, participating. But yes, I mean, the evolution of the interface leading to high impedance and then like degradation both in plane and then inability to cycle is a major issue that people have been working on. We have trouble characterizing it because in our liquid electrolyte cells, we can peel the sample out. We can't quite get to this interface, the solid interface, to study it.
Because they're looking for intimate contact as well. So they try to suppress any interface reactions. So, thank you.
Hi, Betar. Thank you so much for the talk. So for slide 21, when you're talking about exchange current density, what's the overpotential that you're running? And do you think that the trend that you got is because that overpotential is not high enough?
Let me remind myself, what is slide 21?
21 is exchange current density.
Oh, here, yeah. So we'd have to dig into the CVs to tell, but the way that we get the J naught from CVs is we do a TAFL analysis. So we actually do a linear fit, and we look at the intercept with the basically the potential axis, and we figure out, with the current axis to get what the exchange rate would be when projected at equilibrium. So I don't know that it's, we could associate, they're associated overpotentials with that plating and stripping. They're not too high. I don't know off the top of my head what they are, but they're also typical values. They're not outrageous. For the impedance measurements, those are done at rest. So we plate strip normally, but then the cell is resting, so there's no overpotential to speak of.
So you're fitting with both of them, the linear reading?
Yeah, we're doing TAFL analysis from the CVs.
And for the, I think slide 28, for the concentration of 0.1 mole, is it true that we don't see ion coupling there?
Yes, we have validated that. In fact, that was essential to our analysis because in our later description in the binding model, we didn't at the time know how to account for ion pairing. So we check Raman spectroscopy. We make sure that there's negligible anion coordination throughout the entirety of the titration.
Thank you so much.
So in reality, the Coulombic efficiency is also influenced by the cathode side. So in reality, how do we estimate what percentage is due to the anode side lithium plating and what percentage is due to the cathode side?
Well, in a full cell, there's ways to examine that. You can look at things like slippage analysis and kind of infer where the failure, where the degradation rates are. In these experiments, it's true. So this is only characterizing the lithium behavior kind of devoid of a cathode because the other electrode is a lithium reservoir. So it's not fairly predictive of full cell performance, but it's a first start, right? Because high cyclability should translate to, depending on how you design your cell, should translate to a full cell.
So I'm going to miss some of the vocabulary, but you showed this amazing situation where there was lithium islands building that were isolated. And then in the better performing systems, these islands wouldn't be formed when you're stripping the material. Is that a dynamic problem? Is this something that, the speed of stripping influences whether you have these islands forming that are isolated and you can't strip further? Or is this really the behavior of the SEI that you can always get to the lithium and strip it and you don't form these isolated islands that you can't strip?
Talking about this picture, oops.
There was a picture where you had this.
Was it this?
the next, I think, couple down, where there was the first comparison where you had red and then a green skin. Not sure which slide number. I should have remembered this.
Oh. Thank you.
That's a good account.
Yeah, it's going to take me time, but I know what you're talking about. So the question is
The dynamics, how quickly you get sort of the stripping done. Is this a power density type of question?
So in these experiments, we are doing constant current control, and we monitor how the voltage profile is responding in time up to a fixed time, so a fixed capacity. So we are demanding a particular reaction rate when we're measuring the Coulombic efficiency. We can vary that, and we do, but that's like an independent variable. It's a control variable in our experiments. So for a given rate, you will see certain lithium electrolyte extensive reaction and electrolyte A compared to electrolyte B. And then, whether or not it is, we know that rate certainly affects Coulombic efficiency, but it's not always so straightforward to figure out how that is.
Inform these, you sort of get hampered by the fact that you can't get all the lithium out and you have these isolated lithium islands in the SEI.
Yeah.
And in others you don't. And is that...
Right, and that has to do actually, perhaps simplistically, but the mechanics of how the SEI kind of collapses and accommodates, because you're removing material from underneath it. And so if you can't do that well enough, or you preferentially remove material only at the current collector interface, you're left with material that can become encapsulated by the SEI. You can't access it anymore because it doesn't have an electronic pathway to the current collector.
Why does it work?
I'd love to know.
Okay.
Well, I alluded to the fact that it's important to have an SEI that has a kind of uniform lithium flux through it, meaning we're not focusing, our current heterogeneously through certain regions. When you have heterogeneity, it's believed, but this has, I think, not been, it's believed, working description, that like you can have these that will relate to heterogeneous stripping or plating of lithium. So that can lead to overutilization of one area, not enough utilization of another, and then this kind of entrapment process. But I think that's an open area still. It's very hard to just look at the SEI and figure out what it's, we wish we could ask it, but it doesn't tell us.
Yeah, granted. But then if you do that different currents, you change the dynamics, right? You ask for more or less. And then is there some sort of dynamic studies that could hint at that?
Absolutely. I think, so I would say the state of some modeling has actually largely overlooked the presence of an SEI. So looking at kinetic and dynamic phenomena of plating lithium, you can look at how, like, sort of what's happening locally in terms of concentration gradients and the bulk electrolyte and how that, you can perturb that, and then you can see how the resulting depositions will respond. And that's sort of more akin to a classical electroplating type system, absent an SEI. It's a lot harder to get that right with the SEI present because there's so many parameters you would have to put into your model to capture this thing. So I would say, I think that's not, I don't want to say it's not been done, but I think that that's a great question and should be done. And it's still an open area to figure out exactly why these things collapse the way they do.
One last question from over there.
Thank you very much for your talk. So you quantified expectations for the lithium for Coulombic efficiency at the beginning. And then at the end, you mentioned you have some sodium interest. So I'm curious, with the different expectations from sodium and the different reactivity, how does that change how you would quantify your expectations from the Coulombic efficiency of your sodium?
You mean to translate between the two, or are we particularly concerned? Because lithium is very reactive and it reacts differently with electrolytes and all manner of things than lithium.
So you set up your targets of like 99.998 and with a 0.02% room for error with lithium. What would your room for error be with sodium that you would expect?
Well, that's good question. So there's no reason why that would be different. We want same levels of reversibility. It turns out sodium is a very different creature. And we actually already see very high cyclability in very limited subset of electrolytes with sodium. So you can get to 99.99% already. However, it's with a solvent that is not oxidatively stable at high voltages. So we still can't build that into like full cells with intercalation cathodes, high voltage, and a sodium metal anode. So figuring out but it shows that it's possible, right? So figuring out how to kind of get that to be oxidatively stable is one of the major challenges in that field.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for all the excellent questions. Let's thank Professor Gallant again. Thank you all for coming.